So it is a great pleasure to be able to have a conversation today with Dr. Flavio Toxvaerd from the Faculty of Economics at the University of Cambridge, who has been working on the economics of infectious diseases for some time. And with the current situation, it's clearly a wonderful time to be able to sit and talk to him about the whole research area and his research in the area in that area as well. So thank you very much, Flavio, for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for engaging in this conversation.
So first of all, it would be great if you could give us just a little bit of a background of your own research. And have you always been working in this area of health economics? Where are you coming from in this?
So I started out my research career being a run-of-the-mill applied game theorist with a special emphasis on economic dynamics. And I was tackling more or less the kind of questions that mainstream economists are interested in and that are important, of course. And then what happened about 10, 15 years ago, I picked up a book on mathematical epidemiology. And my original idea was to try to see if I could steal some of their techniques for the analysis of propagation of rumors in economic and financial markets. And I realized they had very beautiful models of disease propagation in populations, and I started getting more and more into that topic, and then I realized that there was kind of a very natural overlap between some of the techniques that I've been using to do my other economic research and the kind of models that the epidemiologists were looking at and the kind of issues that they were interested in, such as managing disease outbreaks. And so as I kind of got deeper and deeper into that literature, I discovered, to my pleasure, that there was already an existing body of knowledge within the economics field that had started in the 1980s, and that was that grew out of the necessity of trying to manage the HIV/AIDS epidemic in the early 80s. So there was a small set of papers that had very interesting insights in how to model or to understand human behavior in the face of epidemics. And it might surprise some to learn that some of the early contributors were leading lights of the profession, like the recent Nobel Prize laureate Michael Kramer, who had some of the early papers. And so I found myself very comfortable being there in this kind of interdisciplinary area between economics and public health, with an emphasis on infectious disease epidemiology.
It's interesting. I mean, certainly we've seen that the models that we've been seeing in the news recently, the impact of mathematical modeling has been clearly prevalent with the imperial model particularly, and also the biologists in the field are clearly interested in this. What is the difference? What does an economist bring to this, or what does an economics perspective bring to this, which maybe is different from the existing mathematical biological perspectives?
So maybe perhaps the easiest way to think about it is to take as a starting point a model that describes how a disease would evolve in a non-human population, say a population of cows or fish, or it could even be a population of animals, of plants like trees and so on. Now, in those models, the assumption that the units being infected, that they don't make decisions, is probably a fairly good first order approximation. Now, the problem is when you transport models for non-human populations onto the domain of human populations, you have a problem, because humans actually make decisions. You should think, for example, whether or not to protect yourself or have unprotected sex, whether or not to go out and mingle and socialize in the middle of an epidemic, whether to visit your grandmother, given that you might have symptoms, whether to send your kids to school. So these are all decisions that are made by individuals. Now, if you want to properly understand how an epidemic is likely to evolve over time, there is no way around trying to understand individual decision-making by individuals, and importantly, how those decisions by different people might interact. And so there is in some sense a necessity of the modeling community to tackle with those problems. And it just so happens that economists are fairly well versed in understanding decision making in the face of constraints and incentives. And just to give you a parallel, we ask questions routinely about what would be the impact of a labor market reform. Now, what do economists do to understand what are the effects of a reform or an intervention in the economy? Well, they go and they estimate, labor supply. What are the actual effects of different legislations on behavior? Well, the same kind of analysis in principle can be carried out in the realm of disease management. So if you ask questions such as, if we tell people to stay at home, what are their incentives to actually follow suit? Are they going to be willingly doing that, or do we need to actually enforce that with legislation?
So that's an interesting point that you made between the mathematical models and the biological models. But how is the economist's view, how should that be integrated into the mathematical models? What has the economist got to say that could complement, add to the existing mathematical models?
So that's a very good question. I think maybe the easiest for me would be to share a diagram with you that you may have seen reported in the media. Can you see what I'm showing you now?
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Okay. So this is a diagram that is not one that I've made. This is one that I think was originally published by The Economist or something very much like it. And what this figure does is that it shows the number of cases or number of infections over time across the stages of the epidemic. So the large purple one in the background, you can think of that as being the prediction that is based on a purely biological model. So you can see there's the no intervention scenario, and you can see there are some frightening numbers here, right? You go from almost nothing to a situation which is far beyond what our current capacity to deal with is in the National Health Service. Now, over time, as more and more people have contracted the disease and recovered and developed immunity, over time, the infection will eventually peter out. Thankfully, it seems that COVID-19 does yield some immunity, at least temporary immunity, after having recovered. So this is the kind of the classical evolution of the disease in this kind of model. Now, the key thing here to note is the no intervention word. So if you look at the scientific basis on which the government is formulating its policy, namely the Imperial Report, in the report they describe this kind of scenario as the do nothing scenario. So this is what could happen if we don't intervene in the epidemic. And the reason, of course, is to have a benchmark against which we can measure different interventions like school closures or social distancing. Now, the second graph here is supposed to show what would happen in a world in which we do intervene and we kind of impose or encourage social distancing. And in this graph, we see two things. First of all, the peak of the epidemic is much, much lower than what it would have been in a purely biological model, whereas the extent, or rather the duration of the epidemic is also longer. And that's simply because when you put a lid on infections, then as fewer people become infected, also fewer people recover, and hence herd immunity builds up slower over time with interventions. Now, returning to your question about behavior, well, the thing is, suppose, as this background picture kind of implicitly assumes, suppose that you're kind of around here in the epidemic. It's extremely likely that if you were to go and mingle with your mates at the pub, then you would very likely be infected. Now, you and I both know that you probably think twice about doing so in the middle of an epidemic. What you would be likely to do is to basically weigh the pros and cons of actually going for that pint. So you might decide at some point here that this is just not worth the risk of becoming infected. And so what happens in the economic model is that people for themselves decide whether or not they want to take the risk of socializing. And so what I find is that, and now I can go to the next picture. So this is a simulated disease path in an economic model is a very simplified setting, but it shows an important point. If the dotted line here shows the purely biological model, and the blue line here shows the model that would happen if you rely exclusively on uncoordinated, spontaneous social distancing by people themselves. And what you see is exactly the pattern that we would like to have, which is that you mitigate the peak of the epidemic, you lower the peak prevalence, and you spread it out over time. And so this is very much like what we would like ideally to have.
So what, as I understand it, what you're suggesting is that the no intervention curve would be a curve somewhere between those two extremes on the diagram that you're showing now.
So that's exactly right. I think to their credit, the Imperial Group, if you read their actual report, they actually spell out that the do-nothing scenario is built on an unlikely scenario of people not engaging in any spontaneous social distancing. So they know that they're making a strong assumption on behavior when they paint this picture. The problem is that although they do put in those caveats to their analysis, they then go on to use that as the actual benchmark against which they're measuring the effectiveness of their different proposed interventions. So indeed, what my model would predict is that we would not experience the very, very, very severe one that is the purely biological scenario. But by the same token, we might not be able to achieve everything we would like to achieve with the restrictions without some kind of encouragement to the population. So you would experience something that goes between those two lines.
So as I understand it, that means that there's an intermediate curve here. And what you're saying is that the estimates that we've seen in the papers about the peak levels of infection and some fairly eye-watering, concerning death rates where there was no intervention might actually be overstating the situation in no intervention, because it's not taking into account the natural behavior of people.
Well, I think that's exactly right. Now, the question then becomes by how much? And in order to do that, one has to conduct some serious research about people's, tendency to socially distance themselves. So while I'm very confident to say that we would not have the pattern that is predicted by the purely biological model, I am confident in saying that there will be some kind of mitigation going on simply because of the spontaneous social distancing decisions by individuals. So it would certainly not be as extreme as that, but by how much it would be under that, that's an empirical question that it would only be revealed after careful research.
Which, of course, there's time is of the essence. So do you think that the government's imposition of an intervention, which has clearly got huge economic costs, do you think that is appropriate in the situation, given that this natural occurrence has not necessarily been modeled?
So let me just state up front that I think the government should have moved faster, and we have to unpack that for you. In some sense, the analysis of the Imperial Group and the policy that has emanated from the recommendations has, in some sense, by ignoring behavior, has fallen into two different pitfalls. So the first one is to use the purely biological model as the background figures. So in some sense, that has been, you can think of it as almost alarmist because of the very large numbers. So these numbers are based on a situation where there's no behavior whatsoever. Now, on the other hand, ignoring decision-making by individuals has probably led the government to complacence in the other direction, namely in thinking that individuals in the society would voluntarily do as much social distancing as what we would like them to do. So, and the reason is a classical one in economics, namely the idea of an externality. So an externality is basically the idea that persons or people in society may not factor in all the consequences, positive or negative, that their decisions have on third parties. So let's just give you an example. I'm feeling slightly unwell. I have a little bit of a temperature and I'm coughing, but I'm thinking to myself, well, maybe I have something else. But if I don't go to work, I might lose income, and that's, I have a family to support. And so I might it's not necessarily out of malice, but I might err not on the side of caution, but on the side of getting my income. And so I might be tempted as an individual to be lax with the recommendation and go out and work anyway, and thereby actually making the problem worse. Now, the problem is that when there are externalities like that, it's well known that typically people will not do what is in society's best interest. They might do what is in their own best interest, and therefore under provide the protection that staying at home would have given to all of society. So I think a recognition of that would probably have prompted the government to be a little more robust in their rolling out of social distancing policies, and possibly also to have backed up that with legislation, which eventually was also what happened.
Mm-hmm. And so really, in some ways, you're saying, this is a typical congestion problem. And in this case, it's congestion on the NHS that you couldn't necessarily be relying on individuals to take into that, to make the right decision, because there's a congestion issue in some ways.
So that's absolutely correct. So there are institutional constraints, namely the constraints on the health sector, that complicate the picture even more. So in my basic model, there is no health sector, because I wanted to concentrate purely on incentives of individuals and how those relate to infection probabilities and the disease progression. Now, if on top of that we add another layer of complication, which is the capacity of the NHS to deal with cases, then in some sense the need for flattening curve is just reinforced. So let me just be clear about what I mean. We would like to flatten the curve even if you had no constraints on capacity in the NHS. Even if we could treat every single individual, it is still worthwhile to flatten the curve, simply because of the mortality and morbidity that comes with the infection.
And one's seen that in some cases, examples of people saying, I'm unabashed, but I don't care about myself. And actually, you know what? I don't care about anybody else. If they worry, they should be staying at home. And that's exactly the type of thing you're identifying, isn't it?
So I think that the optimal policy should be a combination of stick and carrot, if you like. So on the one hand, there are some very sensible policy measures that can be introduced. For example, the Chancellor announced that there was going to be statutory sick pay for people that were staying at home for the first 2 weeks after a suspected case. Now, that might look on the face of it like income support, but really what it is a public health measure. I don't think it's a coincidence that it was a 2-week period, which coincides with the recommendation of self-isolation for infected cases. So this is a way, in some sense, is a carrot where we give to people to do the right thing. We're in some sense decreasing people's costs of living up to our expectations of them. Now, carrot might get us a long way in getting people to help out, but there are some people that are beyond reach with carrot, and for those people, unfortunately, we will have to have stick, namely, we will have to have robust measures in place to make sure that the few that do not want to help the public good will have to be in some sense strong-armed into doing it. And there were reports yesterday that somebody got a 600-pound fine for not being able to explain why they were out and about in a situation of social distancing restrictions.
And another area where this comes back, just thinking through, and sometimes you've seen also these extended graphs in which once the intervention is removed, one sees these second peaks exploding in the same way pretty much as that first one does, and that looks pretty concerning in some of those diagrams. But it seems to me that you're suggesting that once again that second peak explosion might not be as dramatic as is being indicated by those models.
Well, in some sense, maybe the way to think about it is that why does that second peak happen? Now, the only way we can have new infections is there's really only one way we can have infection, which is when infected people, they run into people who are not infected. And so this second peak really is an effect of loosening restrictions on social distancing and then having people meet each other again. In some sense, the only way we can avoid the second peak, absent, of course, new measures like a new vaccine or new antivirals, if they were to come in the meantime, the only way we can avoid that second peak is to maintain the restrictions on social distancing until a point in which the amount of uninfectable people, that is, until the amount of recovered and immune people has grown large enough. So there are no two ways about it. We will have to wait until the situation is ripe for that second peak not to reoccur.
So at one point there, you mentioned the importance of herd immunity in the models that are there. And I just wondered if you wanted to explain a little bit more about that.
So herd immunity is a central concept in epidemiology and public health in the context of infectious diseases. Unfortunately, it is also a largely misunderstood term. So when the chief scientific officer of the government, Patrick Vallance, recently mentioned the word herd immunity, I think there was a storm of indignation, and I think it was widely interpreted as the government strategy being just let's do nothing, and you know, who will stand at the end of the epidemic will stand, and the others will fall by the wayside. And I don't think that is a fair portrayal either. So herd immunity is very simply the idea that the more people have been infected in society, the more people will then have become immune. And so those immune people, they protect in some sense the people who have not yet become infected. So it's an inevitable consequence of the disease of the nature that we have now, that some herd immunity will be building up over time, and any policy we may implement, or even if we don't implement any policy, will eventually lead to herd immunity of the population. Now, unless of course the infection mutates. Now, that does not mean necessarily that this should be the objective of policy. Herd immunity is a feature of the disease, but it is not necessarily what should be our main policy objective. Our policy objective should be to carefully weigh all the different interests that we may have as society, one of which is to reduce as much as possible the lives lost or the comorbidities that follow from an infectious disease like COVID-19, but on the other hand, also safeguard our economy to make sure that people who are vulnerable, elderly people, young people, families with children, that they also have a living standard and a healthy living standard that is sustainable going forward. So it's not all or nothing. It's a mixture of those two. And so the optimal policy should really try to carefully balance all those different considerations rather than focusing on achieving a specific level of herd immunity. I think there's a nice metaphor, which is suppose that somebody were to give you the advice that you could run the first hour of a marathon the fastest possible way by running in a particular way. And you might think, okay, this is interesting to know, but that's not necessarily the best way to win the overall marathon. You have to get to the end. And so by the same token, to have a policy in place that achieves a specific level of immunity, say through some policy, rather than looking at the overall trajectory of the epidemic, I think it's unhelpful.
But the information that people have picked up now, I mean, when they're making their decisions, it's about information, isn't it? About what they understand about the infectiousness and the dangers of the disease, which is presumably something that as a community will pick up on. How do you think that would affect the modeling of future behavior, or when the intervention can be removed?
So I think this is a very interesting point, and in some sense, my model relies very much on the idea that people know what are the risks involved. And I think maybe just going back to your question about the second peak. So if the Spanish flu, if you look at the data from that historical epidemic, there was a very marked second peak, and it's well known that the second wave of epidemic can actually be worse than the first one. Now, I think we have a crucial advantage today over what people had in those days, namely we have fairly accurate real-time information about casualties, about infection rates, and so on. So in some sense, we are in a better place today than they were in those days at actually assessing the risks. And I think it is very important that the risks involved are accurately and speedily communicated to people so they can actually react in real time, as it were, to the actual risks involved. But it is also important, and this is very important, that we do not scaremonger and overstate what the risks are, because we then can run into a problem of confidence going forward about the kind of numbers we're given. So I think it's important to have information released, but it has to be accurate, whether or not it is a positive information or positive news about how bad the infection is going to be.
And so, again, one of the things you're saying is that we should be considering individuals' behavior, and that they have the ability to make sensible decisions for themselves, and that's a power that we could harness. But what does that also mean? Thinking about releasing the restrictions going forward, some people are going to know that they're more at risk than others. Some people are going to have different situations around which they would factor in and respond responsibly to. But in many cases, the restrictions are about work conditions. Do you have to go to work? Do you have to get public transport to work? And so there's a question there is, to what ability do I as an individual have to be able to make those decisions? And should the government be thinking about policies that would enable individual decisions to be made on the return?
So I think that this is a crucially important question, because asking people not to go to work is all good and well for people who are let's say high income people who don't depend on paycheck to paycheck. Somebody who's on minimum wage and doesn't maybe have savings, it might be almost impossible for people like that to respect social distancing advice. And so we have to have a concerted package of not just recommendations, but also policies that actually enable and make sure that people are they're actually able to follow that advice. So I think these are unprecedented times, and I think making sure that people have food on the table is crucially important. So I do think that these policies have to be designed in concert.
So another aspect, thinking through of taking into account the individual behavior and that depends on the information they've got. It seems to me that this testing of whether you've had the COVID disease could be quite critical in that, and that it could be quite critical in how you model subsequent behavior.
So the issue of testing has been a very controversial one, and the problem with testing, or rather with the whole debate, is that there are many different reasons why testing may be important, and they are not all, people might not be talking about the same things. So in many instances, the direct benefit of testing may be, let's just say for the sake of reference, a non-communicable disease. Just say some other disease that is not infectious. Now, what's the point of testing in that situation? Well, it's a direct clinical benefit, which is that if you know what is the problem you're dealing with, you may be able to find the right treatment for that problem. Whereas if you don't test, you're basically just acting blindly. Now, in the case of COVID-19, there is currently no no therapy. There are no antivirals for COVID-19. So the direct benefit, the clinical benefit of testing is relatively moderate, because all we can do at this stage is to manage symptoms. So what is the real value of testing in this particular context? Well, the real value is twofold. First of all, is that we actually learn something about the nature of the disease. So in some sense, we are running in real time a natural experiment where we are figuring out properties of the disease, like how fast does it spread, how is it infectious, how many people are likely to have the infection carrying it without showing symptoms, and so on and so forth. So that's the first major, say, non-clinical benefit, which is we learn more about the disease. A secondary one is that the more we test, the more we can actually change behavior. So, for example, if we know that in a particular neighborhood or in a particular city there's been a particularly large number of asymptomatic infected people, we could use that in principle to restrict the traveling patterns of people in that city. So that's, in some senses, more of a utility or a benefit of testing that comes out in the planning stages of how to manage a disease like that. Now, one interesting thing that comes up in the context of testing, which is that the incentives of individuals might not always be aligned with those of a government social planner or a public health authority, and the reason is as follows. Suppose that we were to have a publicly sponsored testing program. Well, what we could do in a program like that is we could actually record the outcome. Now, this is useful because if you, Rupert, say you've tested for whether or not you have immunity to this disease, what we could do, and this has been suggested already, is we could give you an immunity passport, which means you now get a stamp in your document that says you're immune, and then we can let you back into society and pick up some of those burdens that other ones can't do. Okay, so that would be hugely useful. And by the same token, if we knew who were infected, we could ensure that those people, they don't go out and socialize. In some sense, we can use the information in a way that is just very, very useful. Now, suppose we will have widespread private testing. That is, testing that people do on their own. They just go down to the pharmacy, they buy the test kit, and they do it on their own. Well, now people's personal incentives come into play. If you test as being immune, well, in that case, you have no incentive to not disclose that information. It's in your private interest, okay? Now, suppose that you were actually infected, but you're not one of those civic-minded people. What happens then, of course, is that before you might have been somewhat socially distancing yourself because you didn't know whether you were infected, but now the infection has been confirmed, you might be less likely to follow social distancing recommendations, and then, of course, we have a problem on our hands. So private incentives here comes in very strongly when you look at kind of private testing versus publicly implemented testing policies.
And so that sounds to me like, again, within economic models, the behavior of the three different populations, the uninfected, the infected, and the recovered, the behavior of those three populations and the incentives for those three populations will be different. Their responses to policies will be different, and therefore the dynamics, presumably, will be different depending on the proportions and how those change.
Well, that's exactly right. So going back to the recommendations of the Imperial report, if we say, for example, we are going to recommend from the government's side that we want people to reduce their patterns of socializing. If we knew, for example, that all the people who are susceptible, they would respond in this way, and all the people who are recovered would respond in this way, and the same with the infected people, we could get a much, much clearer picture of how people would respond, and also what would the consequences of testing then be. So that's exactly right. Behavior is really the key here. Behavior is what drives people's, or rather, what drives the epidemic, and the epidemic in turn also drives behavior.
And once again, that's something. Now it's more nuanced because, originally nobody was infected. Now, as those infection rates change, incorporating that into the model sounds like it's going to be even more important for the recovery period than it was, the initial crisis period.
No, that's absolutely right. So, why we have the restrictions in place, this is the time to think really hard about what is the end game going to be. And thankfully, there are many people thinking hard about those questions now. How are we going to get out of this situation? Because I think everybody agrees we can't keep on like this forever. The irony is not lost on me that we're doing this over the internet rather than face to face. So we are, of course, right now socially distancing ourselves, and this can't go on forever. And so, a lot of hard thinking is being made now to try to figure out how we're going to get out of this situation now.
So, Flavio, directly, how should the government be integrating and engaging with the work of economists in structuring the policy decisions going forward now?
So I think it's fair to say that there has been a disconnect between some of the policy measures that have been proposed and the scientific advice on which they're based. I think going forward, I think it is crucially important that the modeling community engage with economists that are interested in helping out in this particular context. So just to give you a parallel, so if usually, when a new budget is released, there's been a lot of modeling going on in the background about the likely outcomes of the different interventions. So for example, suppose you want to make a labor market reform, you want to change some policy. Well, what economists will typically do in that situation is they will try to estimate what are going to be the behavioral responses of these different policies. So they can actually quantify these behaviors, and they can then they can finesse the different policies and try to see what is the policy that is achieving what we want to achieve in the best way. So this is a very powerful tool which could easily complement the kind of analyses that epidemiologists have been doing. So again, going back to the Imperial report, if you look at the kind of interventions that are being studied, there are, for example, widespread social distancing. This is one possible policy. And then they have an assumption 75% of the population follow their advice and the rest don't. Well, of course, this is a first stab at the problem, but we can actually be much more precise if we have a quantitative understanding about how people behave in situations like that. Maybe 75% is completely off the mark. Maybe it's going to be 99%, maybe 15%. Well, without a careful analysis, we just won't know. And this is exactly where economists can contribute. And I think it's gratifying that over the last 3 or 4 weeks, there has been possibly more economics research in the field of economic epidemiology than there has been for the last 50 years. So this is kind of the flavor of the month, and some of it by incredibly gifted economists that are now turning their attention to this problem. Of course, economists should also be mindful that they're not biologists, they're not epidemiologists, in the same way that epidemiologists are not necessarily experts on human behavior. But this is exactly why the marriage of the two disciplines can really possibly pay off, not just in managing the current crisis, but also to lay the foundation for the next crisis. Because if there's one thing that we do know is that this is going to come back. And the better equipped we are methodologically, but also in terms of having formulated policies in this space, the better off we will be in the future.
So if somebody from the policy world is interested in thinking about how to engage with economics literature, how to be able to integrate the economics models into their own work,
yeah,
other than, of course, contacting you, but are there other places that they could do to be able to engage with the literature?
Well, yes, there has been a lot of recent interest in research in this field, and there has several initiatives that have come up. Can you see what I'm sharing now? So yep. This is the page of the Cambridge INET Institute, and INET will be releasing shortly a page, or rather, they will set up a page with the research that has been conducted within the Cambridge INET Institute. Another initiative that I think I should mention is the COVID-19 Research Conduit, which is a page that has been set up by leading economists that are all interested in policy issues. And so you can see here there are all the people that are involved in the effort. You see there's lots and lots of people with links. There are resources and articles and policy pieces and just a lot of very useful information. And so I would like to support this initiative and direct people's attention to this resource. And of course, if they want to talk to specific people, then contact them through this portal.
Okay, that's really useful. Thank you so much. That's a really informative discussion. So thank you very much, Flavio.
Thank you. You're welcome. It's a pleasure.